This wonderful service. And to give you a little housekeeping right now, after the service, you're invited to stay for some refreshments. So they're going to set up the room, and we'll ask you just to move to the back of the room while they do that. So please don't rush out afterwards. All right, welcome. And we are live streaming, so we are all on. We're all being recorded. So welcome, everyone. Thank you, Stephanie, very much for inviting me to be here today. It's an absolute honor and privilege. Thank you. I take it deeply to my heart. Today, we are here to celebrate, not to feel sad, but to celebrate a great life, an amazing life, a long life, a longer life than many of us have had the or will have the honor to live. Today, Steve would have been 103 years old. That is simply an amazing. Steve lived a great life, and he knew it. Stephanie will share many stories that will give us a wonderful sense of who he was. Today we say goodbye, but it's not the end of Steve, just his earthly body. I have no doubt that we will all meet again on the other side, and this is a belief that Steve also held to be true. My goal today is to actually inspire you all to feel a little better about death. You know, it's something that we all tend to want to not face. It is something that that we try to ignore, but it is something that we will all have the experience of. Now, some of us depart way too young. Others live longer, like Steve. Amazing of what he must have seen, what he must have lived through. I took a quick look at some pricing items, and just that alone, back in 1923, a loaf of bread was 10 cents. A rib roast, you could buy that for 28 cents a pound. A can of salmon was 31 cents. And the main source of entertainment, of course, was the radio. There was no such thing as streaming. A stream was to go down to the creek. And the average salaries were $3,300 a year, which actually equates to $49,000 today. That's almost truly unequivalent. But a house back then was $6,300, which today would be $95,000. And I don't think we'd find a house for $95,000 today. Now, I personally have been fascinated by death for a long time, wondering also why, because of the unknown that we have, there is a lot of fear. And that is something I would really like to try and unravel for most of us. Most of us, we don't even want to face the idea that we will die. We don't want to talk about death. But it is the inevitable of the end of our journey. And if we can see it more as, the next travel, the next experience, perhaps we can start changing our views of it. We only start to really face the idea of death if we get the unfortunate and horrible experience of being given that diagnosis of ourselves or a friend, that they have only maybe a certain amount of time left. Only then do we say, oh, we're dying, I'm dying, he's dying. But in fact, we're all dying every day. So if we really hung on to that, we would thrive. We would experience life, I think, more deeply. We wouldn't put those things off and say, well, I've got so much more time. Every day is just so precious. Every day is a present. And with that, I'd like to invite up Stephanie, who is going to share many beautiful stories about her dad. She's prepared a beautiful eulogy.
Yeah. Is this okay? Yeah. Okay. I apologize for reading all of this, but I'm not, my memory's not that great anymore, and I will forget everything if I extemporize. So it's all written down. So thank you everybody for coming. I'm deeply touched by this, and welcome to members of the far-flung Whittaker clan. John, Dave, Liz, the two Elaines, Howard, Clive, who are watching this on live stream from various corners of the planet. Hi, guys. So, if I were to ask you what day it is today, you'd probably tell me that it's the first day of spring, the vernal equinox. I know it doesn't look like it, but it is. And you would be right. It is. But for me, today is so much more. Today is the day that my sweet dad would have turned 103 years old if only he'd stayed on the planet a little longer. A few weeks before he died, I told him that we'd have a celebration for his birthday at the Veterans Hospital where he was living. Um, and he said to me, "I'm not looking forward to that." And clearly he meant it. He left us a month ago. For a couple of years before he died, he marveled that he'd been alive for so long, and he wondered why. Why had he made it to 100 and beyond? He was known for asking unanswerable questions, and I'll get to another one of those later. In fact, while the number of centenarians in Canada has been increasing and life expectancy is so much longer now than it was a century ago when he was born, only 0.03% of people in this country are 100 years old or older. It's a very small club. And my dad always seemed to be stunned and amazed that he was a member of it. But then again, when people inevitably asked him the secret to longevity, he'd always say, and some of you know about this, stop eating sugar. It's toxic and it ages the cells of the body. He had read about that sometime in the early 1990s and he decided to go cold turkey. So he stopped eating sugar. Now, in the last couple of years of his life, he did enjoy the occasional, well, more than occasional, chunk of chocolate and dessert. But by then, I think he'd figured out that he had more than proved his point about the toxicity of sugar and its effect on life expectancy. He'd made it to 100 by depriving himself of sugar. But even without sugar, he had a charmed life. Well, I'm heartbroken to have lost one of the best friends I've ever had and someone who was very, very supportive of me all my life. I'm also joyful knowing that he had a really good life, a charmed life, really. Steve, as everyone called him, was born in 1923 in Hemel Hempstead, which was then a small, sleepy town of fewer than 2,000 residents in Hertfordshire, England. It's 95,000 now. To a working class family. His dad, my grandfather, William Whittaker, was in the Royal Navy, and the very existence of my father and his three siblings was all because Granddad Whittaker contracted a virus. Granddad William had been recruited to join the Scott expedition to Antarctica, probably around 1910. But Granddad took ill on the voyage between England and Antarctica, and he was unceremoniously kicked off the ship, in Cape Town, South Africa, to prevent the others on board from getting sick. So he made his way back to England, and he married my grandmother, Ada Parry, in 1915. And that virus kept my grandfather from dying in Antarctica with the rest of Scott's crew, who all perished on that expedition. And he went on to have 4 children with Ada, my dad being the third boy. The fourth child, my Auntie Irene, was the youngest. Now, the idea that none of these children would have existed had Granddad Whittaker made it to Antarctica fascinated my dad. And for him, it highlighted the fragility and serendipity of life. As a boy, he and his siblings attended a Church of England school. And when he talked about it to me, it sounded positively Dickensian. He described the headmaster as a sadist who walked around with a cane that he used liberally on the children. And in those days, corporal punishment was not only permitted, but encouraged. My dad said that the students had to make sure that they weren't in the wrong place at the wrong time, where they could be blamed for things that they didn't do. And he spoke from experience. Life was tough during the Great Depression, and families cultivated their own vegetables and fruit, which I think was the beginning of my dad's love of gardening. He also, as a youth, became a skilled mycologist, learning how to forage for mushrooms for the family without accidentally poisoning them through the wrong choices. And years later, when he was in the Air Force, his commanding officer, who knew that he could identify edible mushrooms, sent him out to forage for them. And he didn't disappoint. He returned to the military base with dinner. Steve was 16 when the Second World War broke out. He joined Britain's Royal Air Force in 1942 at the age of 19. And he told me that he thought the Air Force would be a safer bet than the Army. I think he was right. But it didn't stop his older brother, Jess, from telling him off about joining up at all. Both Jess and Fred, the oldest of the Whittaker children, were in the Royal Navy. And Jess was being protective of his being the protective older brother. He didn't want my dad to come to harm. But miraculously, all three of the Whittaker boys survived their wartime service, and they returned home to England after the war. Their sister Irene was in the Women's Land Army. My dad spent a year or so in basic RAF training in England and would become what was called an aircraftman, essentially a mechanic. He eventually acquired the rank of leading aircraftman. And after training, he was deployed with his squadron to India, as they would call it, which was at that time part of the British Empire, although its days under British ownership were numbered. Gandhi was, making himself felt. My dad told me that it took the squadron, and this is a very funny story, and it takes him ages, it used to take him ages to explain this. It took the squadron 6 weeks to get to India. The planes kept breaking down, and the guys had to stay in Libya and then later the Persian Gulf while they waited for airplane parts to be shipped out from England. 6 weeks it took. And these days, people get antsy if their Amazon order takes more than a couple of days. Eventually, though, they got to India. And like many men of my dad's generation, he didn't talk much about the war. I think many people just wanted to move on with their lives after it was over. But one story he did tell us was about a misdiagnosis. He was lucky. He was with the squadron in India and he was not feeling well. And the Air Force doctor on the base listened to his heart and didn't like what he was hearing through the stethoscope. He thought that my dad had a heart murmur. So he sent my dad to a camp that the RAF operated in the Himalayas for enlisted men in need of, rest and relaxation and stress relief from the war. So my dad did relax big time. He played badminton, he stared at the mountains, he ate well, and he just generally chilled out, which he was very good at. When, after a couple of weeks, he returned to the squadron, the doctor examined him again and declared that there was absolutely nothing wrong with his heart, and they'd probably had a touch of indigestion. The squadron was stationed in India and then Burma, what is now Myanmar, and Singapore. And the RAF kept its presence in Asia after the war was over. So my dad was demobilized in 1947 instead of 45, and he returned to England. Lucky, lucky. Return home after a brutal war in one piece, I think that qualifies as a charmed life. From what I infer, he worked as a photogravurist, and in his leisure time, this very reserved, quiet man got involved in amateur theater with the King's Langley Players. You'll see pictures of him pop up on stage. He performed in plays by Shakespeare, Oscar Wilde, and Noel Coward, and he generally had a great time. And then he met my mom, Marion Brain. She'd come from Yorkshire in 1948 to train as a nurse at the West Herts Hospital in Hemel Hempstead. They met at a hospital dance in 1951, fell in love, and were married the following year. I was born in 53 and my brother in 56. My mother had come from a coal mining village in Yorkshire. My grandfather was a coal miner. And my mom once taught me that before my dad met her, he'd been dating the daughter of a military man, a major in the army. And the relationship didn't last, but my mother said she found it amusing that he went from dating a major's doctor to marrying a miner's daughter. After they married, my parents settled in my dad's hometown of Hemel Hempstead. But after living abroad for 5 years during the war, Steve found England stifling in the post war period. Goods were rationed even until 1954. And to him, England seemed small. It was also rigidly defined by its historic class system that had very little social mobility about it. Moreover, he didn't love socialism and the welfare state created by the post war Labour government. He once told me that the post war British welfare state would never allow anyone to drown, but it sure as hell wouldn't let them swim very far either. He wanted out. His older brother Jess had immigrated to Canada, and my dad wanted to do that too. But he was going to have a difficult time persuading my mother to leave England. She was very attached to her family and couldn't imagine raising her children away from their grandparents. So, sometime in 1956, during the very ugly, dark days of the Cold War that pitted the West against the Soviet Union, my dad mentioned to my mom that if the Reds, the Soviets, were to drop an atomic bomb on Birmingham, it would be game over for the whole country. My mother, my poor mom, who was probably suffering from postpartum anxiety, starts freaking out. Well, what can we do? Where should we go to protect our children? Oh, I have an idea, says my dad. Let's emigrate to Canada. That's it. And that's how it happened. So by 1957, we were here, albeit in Toronto. My dad came to Canada first and found work and housing, and my mom followed with my brother and me. And that was the beginning of my dad going native here. He loved Canada. He loved that he could stretch and breathe here. And for him, the geographic spaciousness of Canada translated into a spaciousness of mind and soul. And there was so much possibility here away from the rigid class system in Britain. And Canada was his spiritual home. We had a little bit of extended family here, too. My dad's brother, Jess, with his wife and their two children, Elaine and Howard, and my dad's cousin, Gladys, and her husband and their 5 children. I mean, immigrants do need the support of family in their new homes, and we had it here, and it was a charmed life. And as is typical for immigrants, my parents had to work really hard to make a comfortable life here. So my mother worked evenings as a nurse to bolster the family income, and my dad had to become both mom and dad to my brother and me. And he was cooking us dinner every night, and he became a very good cook. While we lived in Toronto, my dad took extension courses in advertising at the University of Toronto, and he worked in the advertising department of a carpet manufacturer. We moved to Montreal at the end of 1962 when he got a transfer, and he ended up working in the advertising department of Allied Chemical in the CIBC Tower at the corner of Peel and what used to be Dorchester Boulevard, and he was so happy. The photos of him you might see from that time remind me of the television series Mad Men. Eventually, sometime in the late 60s, he took a job in the advertising department of Crane, the company that manufactured bathroom fixtures, which is why the picture of him standing beside the toilet. And he spent the remainder of his career there, and it was a charmed life. One of his favorite songs was a piece by Henry Mancini that was popular in 1960 called Mr. Lucky. I think he saw himself as Mr. Lucky. At that time, Steve had been married to, in the words of the Rodgers and Hart song, the most beautiful girl in the world, my mom. He had 2 children he loved, a career he loved, and he was living in the country he loved. And he and my mother were diligently saving to buy their first home. So, how lucky can you get? It was a charmed life. Being in Canada, Steve saw that this country of plenty would give him the opportunity to ensure that his children would be well educated. He was determined that Dave and I would both attend university and complete our degrees. Thank you, Dad. And I really am very grateful for that. And Mr. Lucky later thought of himself as Mr. Extremely Lucky when he was blessed with 2 exquisitely beautiful grandchildren, Nick and Emma, with whom he enjoyed close, loving relationships. He was fortunate to live long enough to see them grow into wonderful adults. He welcomed their respective partners, Gina and Stefan, into the family, and he was so excited to welcome two equally exquisite great grandchildren, Tony and Alex, into the fold. He was never a materialist. In fact, recently he told me that he'd never cared about money, really, or material things, but he felt tremendous gratitude for all that a relatively modest amount of money bought: a nurturing roof over his head, his car, which he babied, you all know about that, and food on the table. And he was also grateful for his good health, his loving family. Oh, and a nice glass of chilled Sauvignon Blanc on our veranda. It was about living simply, but knowing that simple abundance is a spiritual gift. I learned from this, and I feel grateful too for all those things and so much more. So, what was Steve Whittaker like? Well, some people would say that despite being a Canadian through and through, he had the aura of the consummate English gentleman. To some people, he looked like the actor David Niven. He was quiet and reserved, yes, but he had a dignified, commanding presence that didn't need to make noise to be noticed. There was a kindness and gentleness about him. He was calm and centered. Children sensed it, and people loved him. During one of their trips to England, my parents were in Yorkshire visiting my grandmother and my aunt, uncle, and cousins. The two youngest cousins, Jane and Lynn, were little girls at the time, and they were fascinated by my dad. He had a habit of napping, and whenever he dozed off in an armchair, these two little girls would lie on the floor on their bellies with their chins in their hands, staring at him, and patiently waiting for him to wake up. Some people thought that my dad was eccentric. I agree. I think he was. He was interested in the big questions: UFOs, the nature of the cosmos, the paranormal, are we alone in the universe, and that other unanswerable question: where did the universe come from? He was fascinated by the Big Bang Theory. How did all this stuff start from nothing? He wanted to know. And how is it possible for the universe to go on forever into infinity? And if it is infinite, what's beyond the edge of the universe? All those books by astronomers and astrophysicists that he read failed to satisfy his curiosity. So after he posed these unanswerable questions to me for what seemed like the 100th time, I told him that the truth about the nature of the universe is something that we cannot know while we are incarnate here in this three-dimensional dimension. Our brains and their limited computing capacity are far too finite. The only way that we can have these answers is by dying. Only by dying do we get to know everything about everything. So I'm guessing he has his answers now. One of the activities that my dad perfected, and you've seen pictures of him perfecting that activity, was the art of a nap, taking a nap. And he could nap anywhere and at any time. And as Winston Churchill did while directing the war effort, my dad would sleep for 15 minutes or so, and awaken refreshed and ready to carry on with the day. There is a Hindi word, which he probably learned during the war when he lived in India. The word is charpoi, and it describes a little day bed that people sleep on. He called napping charping it off, a term probably used by the other lads in the RAF, in the squadron. And if you look at some of the photos I chose for the montage here, you'll see four that depict him napping. And for some reason, people would snap photos of him while he was charping it off. And the reason that it was easy to do that is because he could nap at parties and did. Now, that's eccentric. I recall an evening shortly before Christmas when I was about 18. My friends Pippa and Terry had come to my house to pick me up to take me to a party. And my parents were also getting ready to go to a formal party, the Advertising and Sales Club annual ball. My dad was in a tuxedo waiting for my mom to finish getting ready. And he was sitting in the living room reading a newspaper and chatting with Pippa and Terry while I was getting ready. When he fell asleep with his hand halfway through turning the page, and there it stayed, and that's how he slept, and that's how good he was at napping. As I mentioned, Steve was pretty chill. I think one of the things that allowed him to live a long life was that he didn't worry excessively. He was relaxed, and he could set aside all the cares of the day to fall asleep easily at night. And on one occasion, he and my mom were reading in bed just before falling asleep. My mother was probably going through one of those 1,000-page tomes on medieval history that she loved, while my dad was reading a National Geographic piece about what else? The universe. The story was about a comet, and he turned to my mother and said, "You know, Marion, according to this story, astronomers have found a comet that is moving through this galaxy, and they say if it gets close enough to Earth, it could push our planet off its axis, and that if that happens, we'll all go flying off into the universe. We'll all be dead." Then he turned off his reading light, and said, "Good night, dear." And within seconds, he was sound asleep. My mother, meanwhile, who did not have a chill temperament, lay awake, freaking out and wondering when that comet was going to hit the West Island. But they were very happy together for 48 years, and it was devastating for all of us when my mom died in 2000 at only 69 years old. My dad was bereft. But one of the things that helped him cope with life after my mom's death was that at the age of 78, he took up exercise. Now, he'd been sedentary his whole life, except for a short flirtation in the early 60s when he used to do a workout developed for the Royal Canadian Air Force called the 5BX. But that didn't last long. So when he was almost 80, he joined my gym, Good Life, where there were many other seniors, and he found a wonderful community there. And I introduced him to Don Barnes, who'd been my history teacher when I was in high school. Don was another former Brit who'd had a similar background to my dad, and they got along really well. And my dad was also very close to Andre and Jerry. And with his gym friends, there was a solid community of seniors, at least a dozen of them, met once a month to go out for lunch as a large group. And this was an essential social lifeline for him at that time. And the gym became so important to him that he sold his house and he moved into an apartment in the Southwest One complex because the gym was in the basement of that complex, and he could go there without having to go out into the cold. It was a charmed life. In 2013, Steve took a couple of falls in his apartment. He was 90 years old by then. And Dave and I invited him to live with us in Point Claire. And he'd garden for as long as I could remember, because that's what Brits do. And he loved our garden, most of which was sweeping borders of ornamentals. And he wondered if we could cultivate some vegetables. And I said, yeah, okay. And that was the beginning of me converting most of my garden to food production, which I continue to do. And I'm so grateful to him for that suggestion. And he took care of cultivating the potatoes, which he continued to do until he was about 98, when bending and digging became a chore. But he coached me in how to take over the potato patch. The other thing for which I am deeply grateful is that my dad and my mom insisted on the correct use of language. I passed it on to. Correct usage of grammar and syntax it was built into all of our conversations, as was clear enunciation. And I think my whole childhood was one long elocution class. One of my earliest memories of this occurred when I was 6 years old. My homework was to practice reading. Now, I don't know who's old enough here to remember those Dick and Jane books. Yeah, right. Yeah, the 50s, 60s. So I took out my Dick and Jane reader, as it was called. That's what we called those things. It was a reading primer, but teacher called it a reader. And my dad said, "That is a book. You are the reader." So, first grammar lesson. And without knowing it, he taught me to question the status quo, which served me well when I got into journalism. I have an early memory of telling him something that my teacher had said. He listened, and then he said, "Your teacher is wrong." And he corrected the information she had given me. So thank you, Dad. I now always question authority. And how eccentric was my dad? Well, during the eulogy I did at my mother's funeral, I read a sweet, sentimental poem that, in 4 lines, captured the spirit of a life well lived. Sometime after that, my dad told me which poems he would like me to read, at his funeral. And I promised I would. I apologize up front, but I promised I would. They are the poems of Ewan McTeagle. Now, Ewan McTeagle is a fictional poet invented by the Monty Python comedy troupe for Monty Python's Big Red Book, which was actually blue. The poems also featured in a Monty Python sketch. Now, my dad loved Ewan McTeagle's poems, and sometime around 1980, I happened to pop in to visit my parents when they were hosting a dinner party for friends. And over the dessert and coffee, my dad was reading these poems to his guests, and he could barely get the words out because he was laughing so hard. And he made me promise I would read these poems at his funeral. So I give you the poems of the great Scottish poet Ewan McTeagle. They're kind of stereotypical. Okay. Lend us a quid till the end of the week. If you could see your way to lending me sixpence, I could at least buy a newspaper. That's not much to ask anyone. Second one. Oh, give me a shilling for some fags, and I'll pay you back on Thursday. But if you can wait till Saturday, I'm expecting a dividend, from the Harpenden Building Society. And then there's this one. To my own beloved Mary, a poem on her 17th birthday. Lend us a couple of bob until Thursday. I'm absolutely skint, but I'm expecting a postal order, and I can pay you back as soon as it comes. And the academics who studied Ewan McTeagle say that the recurrence of this theme of desperate search, something perhaps symbolic, perhaps something half imagined, is central to his greatest work, Can I Have £50 to Mend the Shed? Which goes like this. Can I have £50 to mend the shed? I'm right on my uppers. I can pay you back when I get this postal order from Australia. Honestly, I hope the bladder trouble's getting better. Love, Ewan. His other poems include My New Checkbook Hasn't Arrived, Lend Us a Bob for a Wee Refreshment Hen, What's 20 quid to the Bloody Midland Bank? And I'll Just Have to Cut Down on Food. The prize-winning poem to the Arts Council was Can You Lend Me 1,000 Quid? This poem won £1. So, there you go, Dad, because I love you so much. I have just read several of the most bizarre poems ever read at a funeral, which makes me as eccentric as you. And I hope you're happy now. And I really, really hope that you're having a charmed afterlife. And I love you. Thank you.
Beautifully done. Great Scottish accent. Just need a little sip. That was very nice. Really gives us a sense of who Steve was. Now, death is not the end, but rather a transformation into a higher state of existence. And I'd like you to just hang on to that a little bit and feel that. So at a very early age, early teens, I was very fascinated with death, and it was my quest to understand it. It sent me on a quite a quest of reading, finding different books. I was an avid reader. Eventually, this led to some podcasts as well. And the material that definitely showed us that there's much to why we are here and where we are going. Now, I was brought up by a Catholic mom. Mom would often say that if I misbehaved, God would strike me down. We are sinners. That was the message. We may go to hell. That was sort of the running theme. And I questioned that, and I kind of thought, no, there's got to be a little bit more. There's got to be a different way that we can look at this. And so that led to the reading and to the podcast that I listened to describe the other side so beautifully. So what if it's living here that is the hardest thing that we can do? What if returning home to the other side is the most beautiful experience that we have ever had, lifetime after lifetime? Now, near-death experiences are transforming science and spirituality, medicine. And so I've been looking into them a lot more, and a lot more stories have been coming to the foreground. A lot more people have been talking about them and sharing their experiences. And I think that's really important that we get these insights from people. Now, Dr. Brian Weiss, he was the head of psychiatry at the Mount Sinai Medical Center. So very left brain, very logical. Only could talk about very clinical types of psychiatry. But then he had a patient, and he was doing some channeling with her, and this patient started to speak about different things that were happening in the in between. Now, at first, Dr. Weiss didn't want to talk about any of this because he might appear to be a quack, especially in front of his contemporaries and his scholars. But as time went on, she brought him irrefutable proof from beyond, and it became this form of revelations about his family and his dead son who had passed. He became a believer in the other side and reincarnation. And when he first started speaking about it, he was horribly ridiculed and made fun of and taunted. Now, we often find ideas, new ideas, hard to accept when they're a little bit different from what we have been taught to believe. But isn't it wonderful to have an open mind and to listen to new ideas? Now, Dr. Weiss went on to write a book called Many Lives, Many Masters that documents his experiences that now stands very highly regarded in the field. It's a beautifully written book which synthesizes the psychiatrist with the mystic, the promise of personal reincarnations. His regression therapy sessions have helped other patients believe that they've lived before and will again, and their fear of death has diminished. There is another brain scientist, Dr. Jill Bolt Taylor, you may have heard of, that at the age of 37, she suffered from a stroke, a hemorrhoid. And she was also very brain oriented, very logical, very left brain, didn't believe in all this hocus pocus stuff. But while she was undergoing the stroke itself, she left her physical body and watched the whole thing from a place of consciousness. So she went on to write a book called Insight, The Stroke of Insight, excuse me. And that has become a true inspiration to those of us trying to understand what happens when our bodies shut down. Our consciousness, which is pure essence, never dies. There's another fellow just lastly here, Dr. Eben Alexander. He was also a neurosurgeon. He once believed that NDEs, near-death experiences, were fantasies produced by the brain under extreme stress only, until he experienced one himself. After he was attacked by a rare illness, he went into a coma for 7 days, and he experienced an NDE. He went to the other side. And that resulted in his book called Proof of Heaven. Now, when he once could not reconcile his knowledge of neuroscience with any belief in heaven, God, or the soul, he now believes that true health can be achieved only when we realize that God and the soul are real and that death is not the end of personal existence, but only a transition. Now, thankfully, there is much reference material on the subject, and there is a podcaster who I personally love. Her name is Tia Renee, and she interviews a lot of people who have had personal NDEs themselves, and she's got experts on her show. So very, very interesting to listen to and to really help inspire you, really to feel that there is this other side, and it should not be the sadness, but more the celebration that we get to go to that other side. So I share this information to get you excited about where Steve might be right now and that we are all inevitably going. But what is the point of life, right? What's the point of it all? Why are we even here? Could it be that we're just born so that we can die? I certainly think not. And came across this wonderful little short story, which helps answer those questions. It's a little story called The Little Soul in the Sun. And it was written by Neil Walsh, who was the author of the trilogy called Conversations with God. I invite you all to please read that at some point. It's very inspiring, all 3 books. He's written others as well. But this little story was designed for children to read, but it's still one of my favorites. So I share it today. So there's this little soul, and the little soul declares to God and to anybody who would listen, "I am the light." "That's right," said God, "you are." So little soul's pretty happy with herself, and off she went, and she's feeling pretty good. But then she starts getting these stirrings deep within about who she is. It wasn't really enough to know that she was the light. She wanted to experience she was the light. So she went back to God. She asked how she could know that she's the light since it's light all around her. So God told her then that she would have to go somewhere where there is the contrast, somewhere where there is no light. Well, where would that be? So this is how God, I think Earth was created. God told her that the dark is what she is not. Then God explained that in order to experience in anything at all, you must know the opposite. In order to really true know up, we must experience down, hot and cold, joy and sadness, etc. So so that doesn't, yeah, so sorry. All souls are special. And God asked her, what special thing would you like to experience? So she thought about it and she said, well, I think I'd like to experience forgiveness. Well, God said, in order to experience forgiveness, someone must do something to you for you to forgive. So that led to a little soul in the back of the room. He put up his hand and he came forward and he said, I'll go to earth with you. But just remember who I am. When I do something to smite you, to hurt you, know who I am, that we are the souls and the angels. And if it gets really tough, God will send more angels for us. So it's a nice little reminder, I think, for us to think about the people in our own lives, people that not only have brought us great joy and happiness, but the people in our lives that maybe haven't brought us so much joy or happiness, people that maybe have done things to us, have hurt us, have made us angry. If you sit back and think for a minute and think, this hasn't happened to me. I am not the victim. This has happened because of me. I've invited this in because I wanted my soul to grow. I wanted to expand those wings. So today we're sad to know that Steve is no longer walking the physical world with us, but I'm very certain that he's here in the room watching all of us, and he's no doubt smiling. And now finally, just as his daughter promised him years before, he's getting all of his answers to all of those questions about the universe. So in closing, this is a reading that Stephanie has asked me to read with you all. So I invite you all to please maybe close your eyes and really feel it in your hearts. It is the Psalms 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Thank you. And Steve, happy birthday. Until we meet again, namaste. Thank you. Please stay, and if you could move to maybe to the side of the room, you're invited to stay for refreshments. They're going to set up the room with some tables.